Okay, for those of you on the west coast of the United States and in Arizona, good morning. For those of you on the east coast, good afternoon. And for those of you here in Greece, good evening. Welcome to the first lecture of the Greek Archaeology series, co-sponsored by the UCLA Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture and the Cotsen Institute of Archaeology. My name is John Papadopoulos, and I'm proud to serve as one of the core faculty on the Niarchos Foundation Center. I'm a former chair of the Department of Classics at UCLA and former chair of the Interdepartmental Archaeology PhD program. And I'm privileged to work together with Professor Sarah Morris, Catherine Morgan, and Alex Purvis under the direction of Professor Sharon Gerstel. So yeah, you got it. I'm the token male on the board. I'm honored to be the host of this series of 3 lectures, and you may well ask, where am I? Despite the background, I'm not in Selinunte in Sicily, but in Pieria, northern Greece, working on material from the ancient Methone archaeological project. And the best internet in the village of Makrigelos, where I'm based, is right here in my bedroom, thus the need for a virtual backdrop. Now, we've put together what I hope will be a wonderful series of 3 lectures on the archaeology of ancient Greece. The speakers have been, their topics have been selected to represent both a broad geographical coverage of ancient Greece, but also a broad coverage through time. On October 17th, I will have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Marisa Marthari, for Emerita of Prehistoric and Classical Antiquities of the Cyclades, who will speak on her excavations at Skarkos on the island of Ios, one of the most recently excavated and important prehistoric sites in Greece. Next Saturday, October the 10th, we will spiral to the other end of the long durée of Greece, and to one of the most momentous sea battles that was to change the course of human history in Europe, Egypt, North Africa, and much of the ancient Near East. The victory by the young Octavian over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf in southern Epirus. To commemorate his victory, Octavian, who went on to become, of course, the Emperor Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, built his victory trophy at the site of his camp and founded the city of Nicopolis, Victory City. And both the Victory Monument and the city have been excavated over the past few decades by Dr. Konstantinos Zachos, Ephor Emeritus of the Prehistoric and Classical Antiquities of Epirus, Thesprotia, Prevesa, and the island of Lefkada, with funding from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. But today we venture to the heart of the archaic and classical world, that time between the prehistoric Aegean and Roman archaeology, to focus on one of the most haunting and mythical landscapes of ancient Greece, Arcadia. It gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend and someone whose work I've much admired over the years, Mary E. Voyatzis. She received her BA in Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, a postgraduate diploma in classical archaeology at Girton College, University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and her PhD at University College London. The subject of her doctoral dissertation was the Sanctuary of Athena Alea at Tegea, 800 to 600 BC, and its relation to other Arcadian sanctuaries. And she studied under the supervision of Professor Nicholas Coldstream, one of the great luminaries of Greek archaeology in the 20th century. From 1986 until the present, Mary has worked at the University of Arizona at Tucson, where she is currently professor in the School of Anthropology and the Department of Religious Studies and Classics. Having served as head of classics for a decade, beginning in 1999, And she's among a very small number of American scholars who have focused their research on Arcadia. And it's always a privilege and great pleasure to visit her in the field in the mountains of the central Peloponnese. In 2004, she was honored in Athens by the Arcadian Society of Arts and Letters for her contributions to scholarship on ancient Arcadia, with similar honors by the Lykaion Cultural Society in 2010, and in Adritsina in 2013 by the International Society of Arcadia. She's excavated widely in Greece, at Knossos, Kokounarias on Paros, the Megalopolis survey, and for many years at Tegea in Arcadia. Mary is currently the co-director with Professor David Romano of excavations and surveys of the Sanctuary of Zeus at Mount Lykaion, or Lykaion Oros. And most of her research these days is focused on publishing this very important site. She's given numerous lectures throughout the United States and internationally, and among many other duties, she has served on the board of the Hellenic Cultural Foundation and the managing committee of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. She's the author or co-author of 3 monographs, all on Arcadia, some 20 scholarly articles in peer-reviewed journals, and invited book chapters, and the recipient of numerous grants on her work in Arcadia from the National Science Foundation, the 1984 Foundation, the Institute for Aegean Prehistory, the National Geographic Society, and many others. Today, you're in store for a real treat, as Mary will speak on a subject dear to her heart, exploring sacred landscapes in the mountains of Arcadia. Please join me in welcoming my colleague and old friend, Professor Mary Voyatzis.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. John, I'm a big fan of you and all your many contributions to the field, and that high praise from you means a lot. You've contributed to the scholarship in our field like very, very few people in the world. So thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to all of you, to Sharon Gerstel, to Deirdre. I want to thank the Pan-Arcadian Federation of America, the Nea Mantinea chapter, the Hellenic Cultural Foundation of Tucson, and all of you at the UCLA Niarchos Foundation and the Cotsen Center for Hellenic Studies. All of you, thank you so much. And to those of you who are joining from various places in the United States, England, Greece, I don't know where else. I think I just saw Argentina. I don't know. I'm just so thrilled. This is a real treat. I'm going to talk to you today about Arcadia, and I'm going to share my screen with you. So let me see if I can do that now. So here we're going to talk about these sacred landscapes in the mountains of Arcadia. And Arcadia is a place that's very dear to my heart, and I certainly have missed not going there this summer, but I will enjoy sharing it with you today. Right, so let's begin. The region of Arcadia, ancient Arcadia, is located high in the mountains. Okay, located high in the mountains in the heart of the Peloponnese, and you can see the outlines of Arcadia here. It has attracted great interest and attention since ancient times and continues to do so today. Modern Arcadia actually touches the sea in this eastern part, but in antiquity, no part of it touched the sea. It was sort of protected here in the middle. Many of us have had firsthand experience of the region, and I can tell from places where people are from that you have connections to these places, and we're drawn to it for these family connections, or rather just because it's a beautiful place, the famed antiquities, and its offer of a reprieve from the hustle bustle of more cosmopolitan life. We have accounts from ancient authors who've described the region in detail and discuss its rich mythology, its many interesting sites, its unusual gods like Pan, the numerous sanctuaries, the lush landscape, and the important fact that its inhabitants were indigenous even before the moon and the original inhabitants of Greece. Okay. During the Renaissance, Arcadia was depicted in art as a beautiful, pristine, and magical place with unspoiled wilderness. Paintings entitled Et in Arcadia Ego by artists such as Guercino and Poussin in the 17th century reveal a fascination with this region. The title refers to the coming of death even in this pastoral and idyllic landscape of Arcadia. By the 19th century, European travelers were exploring the region, and later in the century, archaeologists began excavating its various sites. For over 140 years, the region has been investigated by archaeologists from Greece and many other countries. Today, we are going to consider some of the sites in Arcadia and focus on two in particular where I have been involved: the Sanctuary of Athena Alea, the top two sites here at Tegea, and the Sanctuary of Zeus on Mount Lykaion, the bottom two here. We shall see how archaeological discoveries have contributed significantly to our understanding of the rich history of Arcadia and enhanced our appreciation of this enchanting mountainous region. My own experience in connection to Arcadia goes back to childhood. My father came from Andritsina, which happens to be in modern Elis, but borders very closely to Arcadia. When I was a child, we would visit his hometown, and for an outing, we would be taken up to the nearby temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassae, which, although is in modern Messenia today, was part of ancient Arcadia. The temple was so inspiring to me and my family. It made a huge impression, especially on me. And as a graduate student in classical archaeology, after a misguided attempt at pre-med as an undergraduate, I should add, I learned more about the special nature of this temple and how the beautiful classical stone Doric temple was preceded by several earlier, more modest structures and phases. As a result, I chose to focus on Arcadian sanctuaries for my dissertation. An extremely important source for our understanding of Arcadia is the 2nd century AD traveler Pausanias, who after visiting Arcadia stated in a famous passage that it changed the way he viewed the entire nature of myth. When beginning my writing, he said, I considered these legends of the Greeks as full of silliness, but coming to Arcadia, I come to hold a more thoughtful opinion of them. In the old times, those Greeks considered wise spoke their stories not straightforwardly, but in riddles. And the ones about Kronos, I imagined were in fact some kind of Greek wisdom. Thus, for what concerns the divine, I will adopt the received tradition. His description of Arcadia reveals a landscape immersed in the religious atmosphere, where old myths and traditional rituals from the earliest times were still practiced. Arcadia was so old it had witnessed the birth of Zeus on Mount Lykaion, as a matter of fact. One of its descendants, the Arcadian king Lykaion, established the first city on earth, Lycosura. He founded the cult of Lykaion Zeus on Mount Lykaion and established the first and the oldest games there. There are many ancient sacred sites throughout Arcadia, and I'm only touching on a couple of them. I have circled in here this western side, southwestern, where Mount Lykaion is, but we have sites all over the region, and they vary depending on whether the site is located in the fertile mountain plateaus of the eastern part or the more rocky mountainous areas in the southwest. In the eastern part, we have Mantinea and Tegea, these rich mountain plateaus that have very important polis we're developing, and many other sites too, Orchomenos, Asea. And then in the west, of course, we have Bassae, we have Berakla, Mount Lykaion, Lycosura, and these other sites over here. In the north, we have Lusoi, which today is in modern Achaea, but there was a very important sanctuary of Artemis up here. Really dotted throughout the region, there are sanctuaries more than you can imagine. And here we see an image of Mantinea, a very important and powerful polis, and behind it the ancient hill of Gortsuli, where in the 60s, I believe, Karayorga excavated and found a 7th century temple, a very simple temple, stone foundations, and lots of jewelry and many, many terracotta figurines. Clearly an important female deity was worshipped here. And here we see the again, the temple of Apollo Epicurus at Bassae. This is the 5th century temple that was built by Ectinus, the same architect who built the Parthenon, according to Pausanias. And here it is covered by a tent, which was put up, a protective tent, in the 1980s. If that tent were still were there when I had visited the site, I don't know, maybe in the 60s, I would probably not be here today talking to you because it would not be so impressive. But this building covered in clouds was awe-inspiring. And I should add that in 1986, this was the first site in Greece to be named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Let's begin now with a little more in-depth look at the two sanctuaries I mentioned. First at Tegea, the Sanctuary of Athena Alea, situated in this fertile mountain plateau at 670 meters above sea level near modern-day Tripoli. We know about this site from the rich archaeological remains, as well as the descriptions of ancient authors, especially Pausanias. And Pausanias tells us that this sanctuary was established by Aleos here for the Tegeans. And later on, the Tegeans built the goddess a large and impressive temple. Not this one, though. The earlier temple burnt down, utterly destroyed, and he tells us even when, the second year of the 96th Olympiad, so we know around 395. And then they built a new temple, and these are the remains you see here. And this was, he says, superior to all other temples in the Peloponnese. He talks about the Doric columns, and on the interior, the Corinthian and the Ionic. He also tells us that a really, really famous architect built this building, Skopas of Paros, who was an architect and sculptor and very well known. The sanctuary was first excavated by the German Institute of Archaeology in the 1880s, and then the French School in Athens in the 1900s, and then briefly by the Greeks in the 70s, and most recently by the Norwegian Institute in Athens in the 1990s. I was involved in this project, directed by Dr. Eric Osby as a principal investigator. The site is most well known for this temple, the 4th century BC temple, reconstructed here, made of Doliana marble, and praised to the skies by Pausanias for its beauty and proportions. It had 6 by 14 columns on the exterior, and here's a head, a skopas head. And on the interior is a reconstruction with the Corinthian columns down below and the Ionic columns up above. We know that there are remains of the earlier temple, just as Pausanias said. My colleague Eric Osby has reconstructed it. It's the red one here, highlighted in red, 6 by 18 columns, built around 600 BC, and also had some marble elements, and it was immediately below the classical temple. And then in the Norwegian campaign, we were excavating. So here's the 4th century foundations, and these walls in here are from the archaic 600 BC temple, the interior rows of columns for the columns. And we excavated in the north. There's a fountain, an altar, the modern church, which you often have a modern church near an ancient temple. We excavated inside the cella, the main part of the building, and found earlier temples going back to the 8th century BC. 2 apsidal buildings, and here you see the 6th century, the 600 BC temple. So in between these 2 rows of columns, we found these apsidal buildings, which are hairpin in shape, made of wattle and daub that are not uncommon in the 8th century BC in the Greek world. These are the very earliest temples at these sanctuaries. And there's a sanctuary of Apollo at Eretria that has a similar structure with an apsidal shape, and also at Hera at Perachora in the Corinthia has a similar shape. This is a terracotta model, but the foundations of the temple also have this apsidal shape. And in many cases, these buildings are later replaced by more monumental structures. So we have, again, this is where all these buildings were superimposed. The altar would be under the modern road where the sacrifices would have been made. The French could dig there, but we could not dig there anymore when we worked here. Before there were any temples at the site, going back, there's some evidence going back to around 3000 BC from early Hellenic, with a modest amount of material. But the next major phase represented is the Mycenaean period, where we have pottery dating from, say, 1400 to 1100 BC, many drinking vessels, also some female figurines, as well as some jewelry. And then the next phase represented is the early Iron Age, and we have a lot of pottery from this phase, say from about 1050 to 800 BC. And the remains are often of drinking vessels, probably from libations poured in honor of the deity, and together with sacrifices that took place, animal sacrifices, at an open-air shrine. And this is before there are any temples. And this is a proto-geometric style of pottery with these concentric, very carefully drawn concentric circles and semicircles that are typical in this period in the Argolid, in Athens, and many other parts of the Greek world. There's also a very distinctive type of ceramics that's connected with Sparta and Laconia, Myklai, and Artemis Orthia at Sparta that has a different appearance altogether, different kinds of profiles, more angular, black shiny paint often, rectilinear ornaments, sometimes grooves and ridges. And this style of pottery was characteristic mainly found only at Laconian sites, but at Tegea we now have thousands of sherds of this type too, which is very interesting. We know the site is to the south of Tegea. And then there's later material, the geometric period from 900 to 700. The most prolific is from the late geometric period. And here we see some little sherds with birds and horses, and there are many, many thousands and thousands. This was clearly a flourishing at the site in this period. And it goes on into the 7th century. This is a Proto-Corinthian Arabalos, probably an import from Corinth, I don't know. And we have many later pieces as well going into the Archaic and Classical period. We also have a workshop, a bronze workshop, and many, many interesting bronze votives were found. The workshop was located in the area, the porch area of the later temple, and it consisted of clay-lined pits with soot and charcoal and evidence of bronze working. And below the pit was a sacred, below the workshop was a sacred pit, or bothros, where dedications were dumped from offerings to the goddess, animal bones, drinking vessels, going back to the Mycenaean period. The workshop, though, is interesting because scholars before this had thought that there likely was local bronze working taking place. And this is a reinforcement that in the 8th century this was going on, because this dates to the 8th century at the same time as the apsidal buildings. We have a great number of animal figurines, for example, horses, many, many, many geometric bronze horses like this one seen here. Also deer figurine, reclining oxen, sheep, goats, various human figurines doing in various poses, carrying water. This is maybe half simian, half human, not clear, but many different kinds of human figurines and huge amounts of jewelry in the thousands. I can't tell you how many pins and rings I cataloged in my youth. And pendants of various types, double axe pendants and many others. And double axe pendants are also found in Sparta, but otherwise not so common in this period. And there are other objects as well, lead figurines, mold made, that are also found in the hundreds of thousands in Sparta Laconian sites, as well as terracotta figurines, animals and humans, and bone objects, and even a tiny bit of gold. In terms of the deity worshipped, scholars debate whether votive offerings dedicated at sanctuaries reveal aspects of the deity worshipped, or rather indicate the concerns of the worshippers. I think perhaps the votives might be useful indicators of both, especially when they are unusual, rare, or locally made. We have here at Tegea, they may tell us something about the local deity, as well as what the worshiper wished to invoke. At Tegea, there's literary evidence to suggest that the local deity was called just Alea, and Madeleine Jost, who's written the definitive work on Arcadian sanctuaries and cults and the literary evidence, tells us that at the beginning it was just Alea. Her name was Alea, and later she becomes associated with Athena, which seems to be proven out also by the evidence that we have found. There are votives that suggest that Alea had aspects of a protectress. There were warrior figurines found. There were these so-called dipolon shields that are like the dipolon shields on 8th century pottery that were found. But there are also other things that are found that suggest fertility of humans and the earth, mistress of animals, associations with deer, life after death, that seem to suggest a broader sense of the goddess that had elements of, say, Hera, Artemis, and Demeter, at least in the early period in the 8th century. For instance, we have this rider seated side saddle, a female nude rider from Tegea. There are other examples, but they are very uncommon. Maybe this one from Olympia was dedicated to Hera. There's an example for Samos, and she's holding a baby, and 2 examples from that Sanctuary of Artemis at Lusoi. There are also a few Bronze Age parallels as well. This geometric bronze disc is quite unique, and it shows a nearly nude female standing on a quadruped, a giant bird watching. She's holding a poppy and really indicating a very powerful female controlling an animal. We have bronze pomegranate pendants, which again are unusual. You find them in Artemis Orthia in Sparta as well, and they often suggest connections with life after death. There's this leaded bronze female figurine with her hands to her breasts that may be late Mycenaean or later, and suggests fertility by her pose. And there are numerous deer figurine, again, not that common at other sites, but found at Artemis sites, and a pleasing offering perhaps to a deity who was also conceived of as a mistress of animals. But by the time of the first monumental stone temple built at Tegea around 600 BC, it is arguable that the deity had become syncretized or connected with Athena, and this later Athena, bronze Athena, found at the site may reflect that very traditional Pan-Hellenic image. We know that the polis of Tegea consisted of 9 demes or communities, and they spread out practically all the way to Laconia. You can see way down here, Arachova. But the main part, the heart of it, is here, the Inhabitants, and here are the later city walls. And you'll notice that the Sanctuary of Athena Alea is not in the center, not on an acropolis, but here on the edge of the city. And in some reconstructions of the walls, it is just outside the city walls, perhaps reflecting the great antiquity of the cult place, but clearly a key and important sanctuary throughout the history of Arcadia. Okay, let's move to another sanctuary, a very different one in the western part, and that is the Sanctuary of Zeus at Mount Lykaion on the southern peak. It consists of an upper level here where you have the ash altar, and this is at 1380 meters above sea level, so a lot higher up compared to Tegea. And then we have a temenos, or sacred precinct, about 25 meters down. And then halfway down, there's an Algno fountain. There's a lot of water at the site. And we know this, there was tectonic activity and many springs throughout the site, and water management was critical. The lower sanctuary is the athletic and administrative center. We have the various buildings here that we'll talk about in a minute. Pausanias describes the site in detail. And he tells us that there was a sanctuary of Pan, although it is yet to be definitely found. But he says there was a grove of trees around it and a hippodrome in front of which was a stadium nearby. So somewhere around here was a sanctuary of Pan. Here you see the stadium and hippodrome. And he talks about the ancient Lykaion games taking place in this area. Of the temenos, he says, this is a really creepy place. He says that one of the most astounding things is that if you stepped inside the temenos, you would die, certainly within the year. So that's the word about the temenos. And then with the altar, he says, from the highest peak, there's a mound of earth, and from here you can see nearly all of the Peloponnese. And in front of the altar, there are some column bases with columns and golden eagles on top. He also mentions a really creepy ritual that took place, a sacrifice. He does not want to go into detail, but he isn't referring to the many rumors of human sacrifice that are mentioned by numerous ancient authors. The site was excavated by the Archaeological Society at the turn of the century, most notably by Konstantinos Kouroniotis, seen here, and most recently in a collaborative project since 2004. We've been working there, and this is our 2019 team, wonderful team. The current excavation and survey project is directed by Dr. Anakara Panayotou, who is the Effer of Antiquities of Arcadia. Dr. David Gilman Romano and I are co-directors, and it is all under the auspices of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. We excavated first from 2006 to 10. We had study seasons from 2011 to 2015, and we had a renewed 5-year campaign since 2016. We were meant to go back in 2020, but you all know why we didn't. And we are going to be back in 2021. And I am delighted to share some of the results of this ongoing work that we're doing. So at Mount Lykaion in the upper level, there was this impressive monumental altar to Zeus. We call it an ash altar because of the accumulation of all the burnt animal sacrifices that took place here over the centuries and piled up to form a mound of ash. on top of the peak. Here you see the bases were found by Kourignotis. No golden eagles were found, but Kourignotis did find a bronze one. In our recent campaign, and close to the middle top of the altar on the bedrock, what appears to be a man-made architectural platform oriented due north was found in 2010. It was we think it was the focus of a lot of cult activity. We had a lot of very fine pottery and terracotta dedications of animals and humans. Our team has continued working to the west of the platform, and we're finding more high quality and quite complete Mycenaean pottery and figurines. It was also in this area, here is the platform, to the west of a jumble of rocks, where in 2016 we had the stunning discovery of a human skeleton, seen here. Likely a male adolescent in a simple burial aligned more or less east to west. It caused quite an international sensation when it was discovered, as you might imagine, and everyone was reminded of the many legends of human sacrifice associated with the ancient sanctuary. The skeleton is currently housed in the Wiener Lab at the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, where it has been cleaned and extensively studied. Dr. Eliana Prepodorou has been in charge of that, working together with Greek colleagues. And there will be a formal announcement made soon about all the different analyses done, but we can say now definitively that the carbon-14 results indicate that the skeleton is not ancient. So no human sacrifice from antiquity, sorry. And I will add that no human bones have been found in our campaign or in Kourignotis' either. From the altar, huge amounts of prehistoric, really early material was found in large numbers. Final Neolithic, early Hellenic, middle Hellenic pottery going back to say 4000 to 1600 BC, more or less. And we recently uncovered more huge amounts on the eastern side of prehistoric pottery. It's coarse, large concentrations, and some of it has this incision and maybe dates to the transition to Middle Hellenic and is called Adriatic ware. We have specialists, Susan Petraikis, Jeanette Forsan, and Gulag Nordquist studying our prehistoric pottery. We do not, let me go back a minute. We do not know the function of the site during these early years. It is conceivable that there was a nature deity or something like that worshipped here, but it may have had a different function, maybe a location for tending sheep and goats that roamed the hillside on a seasonal basis. Given the location, the winds, the severe storms in summer and winter, and the generally inhospitable nature of the altar for any long period of time, it is unlikely it ever functioned as a habitation site. We can say, based on the ceramic analysis done on a sample of the material at the Fitch Lab at the British School in Athens, that it was locally made of fairly coarse, low calcareous clay. The next phase is the Mycenaean phase, and there were a lot of drinking vessels, these stem drinking vessels or kylakes, as well as other types of Mycenaean ceramics found, say dating from about 1500 to 1100 BC. This was a surprise at first because prior to our campaign, what we knew from Kourignotis was that the pottery at the altar consisted of black gloss sherds of the 5th and 4th centuries BC. So we were very surprised to have this earlier pottery that seems to continue into the early Iron Age without interruption. There were also animal and human figurines found in this area as well, as I've mentioned before. In addition, many heavily burnt animal bones were found, and they calcined bones together with the pottery and the finds. A rock crystal lentoid seal depicting a frontal bull, you can see it in the impression here, and this is the actual seal, was found as well in the altar and appears to be a Minoan import from Crete. Large amounts of early Iron Age ceramics were found of Western Greek style, which is very different from what we saw at Tegea, including ribbed kylix stems like we see here. And we have these drinking vessels or skiphoi with just a reserve band, very simple decoration, or we have these concentric triangles or loops. We have parallels for these sorts of decorations, these sorts of pots, from other Western sites like Messenia with skiphos with a reserve band, the island of Ithaca, one of the Ionian islands to the west, again, simple decoration, and also Olympia, where we have this early Iron Age pottery. Here we have the concentric triangles and zigzags like at our site. In addition to this material at our site at the altar, we have Lykaion material like we found at Tegea. there is this that's simpler, less of it is decorated. Usually it's just black gloss with ribs, the angular shapes, and grooves and ribs. There's also later material, probably some late geometric, early 7th century, Proto-Corinthian, and even going to classical, and even a little bit of Hellenistic. And Anne Steiner and Susan Rotrop are studying our classical and Hellenistic respectively. Unlike Tegea, there are very few early votives from the altar from say the 8th century or 9th century, and so far not a single geometric bronze horse or other animal or human figurine, little jewelry. Some objects like these mini tripods and these other objects, the bronze and iron and the coins, were found by Kourignotis in his excavation. And many more were found of these, say, for example, the mini tripods were found by us. These bronze sheet tripods were found in the many, many dozens by us, and they're similar to examples from Olympia. But Olympia has many more, and Olympia also has large full-scale ones, which we have not yet found. Other samples of the types of things that were found, and I want to say that these were all found through the sieving of the soil, because the material we know now from micromorphology and Dr. Susan Menser's work, that the altar was composed of pulverized animal bone. And so we had to sieve everything and found lead figurines, this is a little lead kouros and lead wreaths, many silver coins from various regions, an iron double axe. And in 2019, we found even our first piece of gold from a ring, probably. And many other finds as well. What we don't see, though, are the thousands and thousands of votives that go back to the 8th century that we see at so many Greek sanctuaries. There are thousands and thousands of animal bones, though, and these are the thigh bones or the femurs, the patellas or the knee bone, and sometimes the tailbone of goats and sheep. We found tons of this material in the altar, some of it in the lowest levels, and in 98% of the cases they were burnt, heavily burnt or calcined, suggesting that there was this ritual or thesia, sacrificial ritual taking place at the altar over many centuries. One question we had was, well, how far back can we trace this? We know that this was the core ritual at Greek sanctuaries in later periods. There are literary descriptions in Homer and Hesiod, and there are depictions on pots, as we see here on these later pots, bringing the animal for sacrifice, where the thigh bone would be cut out, wrapped in fat, roasted at the altar, and then there would be a feast for the community. This was a prescription. It was a very specific details of how things were done. So we conducted a carbon-14 analysis funded by the National Science Foundation on calcined bone from goat and sheep femurs or thigh bones, and we took samples from various levels down to bedrock. And we found that the earliest calcined femurs date back to the Mycenaean period. This work was done by Dr. Starkovich and Dr. Hodgins, and the earliest dates were in the 16th and 15th centuries BC. Mycenaean period, providing direct evidence for animal sacrifice that shows that it was a feature of activity from this earliest phase. It seems that the ritual continued through much of the life of the century until the 4th or even later centuries. There are other sites that have revealed some evidence for burnt animal sacrifice, including the Palace of Nestor at Pylos, where there were burnt cattle bones found, and there are mentions of burnt bones from Epidaurus, and from the cult center, there are mentions of burnt bones from the cult center at Mycenae and a few other sites. It is becoming increasingly clear that this ritual of offering burnt animal sacrifices to the gods begins in the Mycenaean period, and the evidence from Mount Lykaion perhaps offers the strongest and most compelling case to date. The lower level of the sanctuary next is 200 meters below, and in this mountain meadow, and there are many buildings, and I'm just going to draw your attention. Of course, they've all been ruined, but there was this long 67-meter long stoa here. The seats or steps that are in front with the same alignment down the hill. An Ionic building that was found by Kourignotis was buried, and we started to find it a couple of years ago again. What we think might be the Sanctuary of Pan. A large administrative building here that Kourniottis had called the Xenon, a fountain, a long corridor that leads to the hippodrome. And I'll show you a little bit more detail of these buildings now. We have here the 67-meter long stoa, and at the western end, we have found evidence for an early Byzantine structure built inside of it. We also in 2019 found a back retaining wall of the stoa. Lots of Byzantine material has been coming up from our most recent excavations as well. And then these seats or steps, which would have been a good place to view some activity that was taking place over here. Here's David Romano giving a tour. And the 4th century was when all these buildings were likely built. But deep down below in this area, we found material going back to the 7th century, like this piece here down this base. And the possible sanctuary of Pan, you can see it here. This is where it's located. So you get a sense of the lay of the land of the lower sanctuary with the bath facility, the hippodrome, the stadium, the stoa, the seats. And here we're looking at the possible sanctuary of Pan that we're continuing to uncover, a large area. The administrative building, a multi-level, multi-storied structure that we're continuing to excavate. And then this long 30-meter long corridor with an arch that became apparent in 2016 and a series of steps as well at the other end. And here you can see the sort of extension, the whole thing. The administrative building is here, and then the corridor is here. Steps, arch, and it continues to the north towards the stadium and hippodrome. Probably the athletes processed through this corridor and went to the hippodrome and stadium. And then here we have the hippodrome and stadium where we've opened many, many trenches for the horse racing and the human racing. The bathhouse in this northern part where our Greek colleagues are working. And a fountain house, again, this water, important source of water for the site. And then recently the Ionic hemicycle building that's been found, rediscovered. It's a marble building. It must have been a very important building originally found by Kourniottis, and we're still not sure of its function, but we're excited to be uncovering it. In the Sanctuary of Pan, we were excited because we found our first piece of red figure pottery in 2019. You can see the little toes and the feet, the frontal feet, and the drapery. This is a classical piece and many other important finds. And in the nearby administrative building, we found a cast bronze hand of, we think, the god Pan holding a panpipe. And it's very well preserved, very detailed, and maybe broken from a statue of Pan. And here you see an image of Pan holding his panpipe from Pompeii. The Lykaion Games were part of the festival in honor of Zeus, Lykaios, and 2 victor inscriptions found by Kourniottis in the administrative building reveal the pan-Hellenic nature of the games by the 4th century anyway. When participants were coming from as far away as Sicily, I point out Syracuse to you here, for example, Macedonia, Cassandreia is mentioned here, Rhodes, and other places within Macedon as well from Macedonia, and other places as well from the Peloponnese. We do not know how far back we can trace the games at Mount Lykaion and when the hippodrome and the stadium started to be used in the lower sanctuary. But in the upper sanctuary, below the altar and beyond the temenos in a very level area, we've been excavating something called a proto-stadium, possibly. David Romano, my colleague, thinks it's conceivable that this would have been a location, it's flat, it's even, where games would have been held prior to being moved to the lower level of the site. But this remains a hypothesis for now. There is no question that Zeus was honored at Mount Lykaion in the by the late 7th century to 6th century. There are many votives that were found near the temenos by Kourniottis, and I show them to you here, depicting Zeus. And more recently, we have found this bronze right hand of Zeus holding a silver thunderbolt and many Arcadian coins, Arcadian League coins showing Zeus as well. And this reinforces who was worshipped here. But how far back can we trace his worship? If we are correct in our interpretation of the continued use of the altar from the Mycenaean period through the early Iron Age and until the Hellenistic period, and taking into account the burnt animal sacrifices that were being made over those centuries, we could argue that the deity and the core ritual remained more or less constant. And it is well known that Zeus's name was listed as a recipient of offerings in the linear B tablets in the Mycenaean period. So it's possible that it goes back to the Mycenaean period and continued on. The establishment of a cult place on the bedrock of the southern peak of Mount Lykaion and the site's exposure to the elements, and you can see here a thunderstorm taking place, or frequent thunder and lightning storms, makes it a good location to dedicate to the premier sky god, already even in the Mycenaean period. Before that, though, we cannot be sure. It is likely that the local communities called the Parasians played a key role in administering the Sanctuary of Zeus and organizing the Lykaion Games prior to the 4th century when Megalopolis was founded. The Parasians are mentioned in the Iliad by Homer, and they're considered to be a very old ethnic group. This group of communities that weren't organized around polis, but instead more loosely organized, spread out over a large area. And here you see the area in red, but it includes later Megalopolis and all these communities here. The cult of Zeus Lykaios probably began as a Parasian cult, and later the cult and the Sanctuary of Zeus Lykaion became a crucial element of a unified Arcadian identity. The Parasians were later incorporated into Megalopolis when it was established in the 4th century, and this newly founded city likely played a critical role in the elaboration of the site. The pottery from the altar reveals connections with many other regions of the Greek world. This slide shows you sherds that reveal associations with other regions, either that were shown through ceramic analysis or by eye, typically my eye. We conducted a ceramic analysis project at the Fitch Lab at the British School in Athens on sherds from the altar. The results showed that ceramics revealed connections with areas well beyond the Parasian region, which would be right here in the middle, and beyond Arcadia, already in the Mycenaean period. We were able to isolate a possible local source with low calcareous fabric in the Parasian region at the foothills of Mount Lykaion, near the lignite mines, based on petrography and chemical analysis. The local group consists of Mycenaean kylixes, and they have a low calcareous fabric. And here's a stem from a kylix that has been tested ceramically and connects to this part of the world. But other groups have medium and high calcareous fabrics and may be connected with regions further away, as you can see from this slide. We are building on these results and have recently been awarded a new 3-year NSF grant to do a broader paleomobility study in which we shall do strontium isotope and carbon-14 analysis on a large sample of calcined animal bones from the altar. And here you see our little goats and sheep up at the site. And we also are going to do more ceramic analysis. The results of a 2017 pilot study on the strontium content, and this is something that's formed in our teeth and bones in animals and humans, and reflects often where we come from. So that was done on sheep and goat bones from the altar and compared to bone samples from various locations around the Peloponnese. And it suggests that animals were being brought to the altar at Mount Lykaion from locations well outside the local area already in the late Bronze Age. The present evidence suggests that in the Mycenaean period and into the early Iron Age and later, that the site might have functioned as something of a prototype for a Pan-Hellenic sanctuary with people coming from many locations, sort of a model which became popular in the historical period, like at sites such as Olympia. One more interesting note on the great antiquity of the region around Mount Lykaion. In the Parasia, at the foot of Mount Lykaion, in the Megalopolis Basin, and here you see Megalopolis and the lignite mines, and Marathuso is a site that's currently being excavated by the University of Tübingen and Greek colleagues, has yielded ample evidence of fossilized bones indicating the existence of large mammals in this vicinity, where we know maybe 780,000 years ago, before present, there was a large lake in the western half of the megalopolis basin in the Middle Pleistocene. The lake provided swampy, boggy conditions, which much later led to the creation of the lignite, which we all know so well. Around 300,000 years ago, the present drainage system was established when the Alpheus River opened up and flowed into the Ionian Sea. Excavations here have yielded remains of elephants as well as lithics of flakes and cores. This evidence suggests that early humans were exploiting the animal resources in the area and that this was an elephant butchering site. The lithics appear to be locally made, and the date of the site is about 500,000 years before present. After the shallow lake of Megalopolis drained away and the Alpheus River was created, the vegetation could no longer support the mammals and they eventually disappeared. And as the Alpheus and its tributaries eroded, the animal bones were exposed, a process which has probably continued since antiquity, culminating in these paleontological sites being revealed in the recent lignite mining. References in Pausanias suggest that the ancient people in this area knew about these bones and tried to understand what they might mean. Pausanias talks about the battle of gods and giants and says it took place here in the Parasia at a site of Trapezus. He talks about huge bones being found in the sanctuary of Asclepius, the child in Megalopolis, that must have belonged to a giant. So it appears that these ancient peoples in the region, Megalopolis, likely happened upon these mammal bones from time to time and attempted to explain them and wove their myths and legends around them. So we have considered today the evidence for the great antiquity of Arcadia, the fascination it held for people since antiquity, Pausanias' conclusion that the mythological stories from this region were spoken in riddles and contained wisdom. And we looked at two sites in particular. One, Tegea, might have been a cult place from the Mycenaean period, we're not sure, but certainly it became very popular in the early Iron Age, flourished in the 8th century when the polis of Tegea was in its formative stages. Activity continued to be very strong through the Archaic and Classical periods, with building of two impressive stone temples, especially the 4th century one by Skopas. We see parallels to other neighboring sites in Laconia and the Argolid, and given its location here, critical location at an intersection of major routes through the Peloponnese, it's not surprising that the site developed as it did. The other, at Mount Lykaion, arguably had its heyday in the Mycenaean period when the mountaintop shrine was a major open-air cult place, attracting people from relatively nearby and also from more distant areas. Ritual activity continued uninterrupted, it appears, into the early Iron Age, when it was also a very popular site, to judge from the large amounts of pottery. It developed into a famous Parasian sanctuary, but there was never any huge surge of activity that we can tell, at least now, like we saw at Tegea in the 8th century, nor was there a temple that we know of to Zeus built in the upper part of the sanctuary, when monumental architecture was occurring at most sites. It might be in part because the altar itself, in and of itself, was monumental in nature and likely inspired awe. In the late classical period, the site experienced a major building phase with the elaboration of the athletic festival and the lower sanctuary. Mount Lykaion has many similarities with the nearby Western Greek sanctuary of Olympia, the Sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia, which is not that far away, maybe 22 miles away as the crow flies. But the latter took off and became one of the most famous sites in the Greek world, if not the most famous. The greater antiquity of Mount Lykaion, however, in relation to the one at Olympia, may be significant. And preliminary data from our new research proposal on paleomobility indicates that Mount Lykaion may have functioned as a sort of prototype for a communal pilgrimage site already from the Mycenaean period. One final point, I'm almost done. A key initiative born out of the Mount Lykaion excavation and survey project has been the proposal to create Greece's first large-scale cultural heritage park. The purpose of this park, about 700 square kilometers, is to preserve and protect this wonderful landscape, which incorporates parts of Arcadia, Elis, and Messenia. So you see Mount Lykaion is here, and we have the Parasia region here, and we have many of Andritsino, my father's hometown, is part of it, Megalopolis. We see many other sites that actually parts of it are in the bordering regions of Elis and Messenia today. And it will include walking trails, local products, ancient and modern sites and sanctuaries. In May 2019, my colleague David Romano organized an international scientific meeting at the American School in Athens related to the creation of this park. The meeting was held under the aegis of the then president of the Hellenic Republic, Mr. Prokopios Pavlopoulos. Once the park is formally established, we hope to create a research center somewhere within it for scholars studying the region to be based, to hold conferences, have exhibits, and so on. To this end, I am currently working with architects and engineers to get a building permit to convert the old family home in Andritsina, which is within the park, into a research center. My father, who came to the United States in 1952 as a graduate student and stayed till his death over 50 years later, never lost his love for Greece nor his hometown of Andritsina. And here you see him in the 1960s, and here in Greece maybe 30, 35 years later. I believe he would be thrilled to see the family home become the research center and a focal point for the Parasian Heritage Park, serving to protect and preserve at least a slice of this magical landscape for all time. Thank you for your attention, and thank you to all our many individuals and institutions.
Thank you very much, Mary, for a wonderful lecture.